connecting the pituitary gland to the rest of the brain. That's the structure we're going to try to identify here. So once you've carefully peeled this off, you can sort of set it to the side. Your pituitary gland is still attached here, but we've got some remnant of that tube. That's one of the items that we're trying to identify. So as we continue on the ventral side, that tube that was connecting to the pituitary gland, that's the infundibulum. That's the stalk that allows the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Again, remembering from topic 13, the endocrine system, the hypothalamus releases hormones that are carried by a special set of blood vessels to the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary. It also has a direct connection through the infundibulum to the posterior pituitary to release hormones like ADH and oxytocin. So this is a connection that allows the hypothalamus to communicate with the pituitary gland. So it's vitally important for the functioning of those systems. The next, and depending on how yours rips off, you may end up instead of a tube with just a hole. That would correspond because the infundibulum is hollow because cerebrospinal fluid circulates through there, so it is a hollow tube. So if you just end up with just a hole, that would be the remnant of the infundibulum as well. But if you can, keeping it as a tube makes it a little bit easier to see. I just about tear it all the way off. The next item on the list is the mammillary body. That's going to be the area right around, clean it off a little bit better. That's going to be the sort of V-shaped area right around the infundibulum and right behind the optic chiasma. This involved a number of important reflexive behaviors that are controlled by the cells inside here. So things that you're not consciously aware of that happen automatically, the mammillary body does a bunch of those. Behind the mammillary body, you have these two sort of oval structures called the cerebral peduncles. And these have some important control over the movement of your eye. And they do that through the third nerve, which again, depending on how your brain is set up, if you see, it'll just be sort of a flat sheet like the one that I'm lifting up. That's the oculomotor nerve. It's one of the nerves that controls the movement of your eye muscles. There's other ones that we're not going to look at, but that's a major one that does that. So the cerebral peduncle is involved in regulating eye movement through these nerves. It does other things, but that's an important thing that it does. Behind the peduncle, we have the pons, which is, it's a single structure, but it's got kind of two halves that are circular right behind the peduncles. The pons regulates a number of the autonomic functions of your body, sort of the day-to-day keeping you alive type stuff. It has centers that affect cardiovascular and respiratory activity, so heart rate and respiration rate are affected by the pons. And then right behind them, we have this large sort of V-shaped structure, which would be the medulla oblongata, which also controls more autonomic functions, including it also has an impact on heart rate and respiration, along with other factors like digestive system activity and things like that. So a lot of the stuff that's happening that you're not consciously aware of, the pons and the medulla, either alone or together, are regulating that in various ways. Cerebellum, you should end up with two halves that are basically mirror images of one another that look like this. The structures that you're identifying here, some of them are the same ones we already saw. For example, you can still see the sulci and gyri of the cerebral cortex that we saw when it was a whole brain. The corpus callosum was a thing that you had to cut through. The corpus callosum is a thick network of neurons that cross from left to right so the two halves of the brain can share information. If you cut these, you get all sorts of weird things happening because the two halves no longer can communicate and function. The corpus callosum is typically going to be this sort of upside down Nike swoosh type thing in terms of its pattern. And again, it tends to be white because there's a lot of myelin on there. There's a lot of myelin to make the information travel very quickly. So the corpus callosum is one of the places, not the only place, but one of the places where information crosses from left to right. It's a very important place to do that. Next item on the list, underneath these corpus callosum, and there may be a membrane here that you kind of have to pull apart. Let's see if the other one's like that. Yeah, so here you can see as I pull it apart, underneath my corpus callosum, there's kind of a membrane here, but if you pop that a little bit, you'll see there's a large cavity. That's the lateral ventricle. There's one on both sides, so there's two lateral ventricles. As I mentioned earlier, the brain has hollow spaces where cerebrospinal fluid circulates. The ventricles are one of those areas. So there's a ventricle underneath each of your cerebral hemispheres. This is because your brain does not have access to blood directly. It has to get nutrients and oxygen from this other fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid. So having space to circulate so that it can get to different parts of the brain is very important. The next couple of items we saw before on the intact brain, but we'll see them again here. Your pineal body, or pineal gland, you'll be able to see has been cut in half. And then your corpora quadrigemina with the superior and inferior colliculus has been cut open. You can see the same structure that you saw before. One way to sort of check yourself sometimes, sort of put the two halves together and make sure that what you're identifying is the same thing you saw in the intact brain. That's a useful way to test yourself and make sure that your identifications are correct. The cerebellum, that big lump of tissue, inside of that we have a network of white matter, again, myelinated axons. It's called the arbor vitae, which is Latin for tree of life. This is named for the fact that if you get hit on the back of your neck, it tends to be very damaging and potentially lethal. And the idea was they thought that, well, that type of injury would hit your cerebellum, that must be what kills you. So that the cerebellum has a tree of life, but if you damage it, life is done. Turns out that's not the case. Again, the cerebellum is involved mostly in motor fine-tuning. So damage to the cerebellum is not good, but it doesn't tend to be life-threatening in and of itself. What does happen to be life-threatening is damage to the pons and the medulla. So if you get damage on the cerebellum, you probably damage the pons and the medulla too. That's what tends to kill you. That's where your respiratory and cardiovascular centers are. So the heart and lungs stop working. The pons would be the bulge right here, sort of in front of the cerebellum, and the medulla would be an enlargement directly underneath the cerebellum. And again, those are things we saw on the intact brain, so you can put it together and sort of